Alright, so we've learned how to factor when we have three terms. Let's take a look at a situation where we have four terms and the directions are to factor. What we'll do is called factoring by grouping. What that means is we're going to go ahead and group the first two terms as you see in red, and we'll also group the second two terms completely as you see in blue. Looking at the first two terms, we need to figure out what greatest common factor they have. In this case, we have an x squared. Now we're going to write down what remains if we were to factor out an x squared. X plus 7. With that done, we move on to the blue. Looking at the blue, we need to decide what do those two terms have in common. They have a positive 3 in common. What remains is going to be a x plus 7. Okay, so far we've factored this by grouping the first two terms and the last two terms. The first two terms you see in red, and the last two terms you see in blue. What we're going to do next is write the term that occurs twice, and that would be your x plus 7. We then are going to write the terms that occur after that, x squared plus 3. Looking closer at this, if I were to look at the term that repeated itself twice, that would have been the x plus 7. The x plus 7, that occurs once at the next step. What I had that remained after that would have been an x squared and a positive 3. So x squared plus 3 would have been my next term. Overall, my final answer for this problem would have been x plus 7 times x squared plus 3. Circle it for full credit. This second example is very similar to the first example. If our directions were to factor the expression, we would notice that there are four terms here. Therefore, the method that we're going to be using is factoring by grouping. If we were to factor our first two terms as you see in red, and our second two terms as you see in blue, we would find that the greatest common factor of my first two terms is 2x squared. What would remain is going to be a 2x minus 3. Looking at the blue, here is something that's a little bit different. The first term in the blue is negative. That means no matter what, I'm going to want to factor out a negative greatest common factor. Now, among the 6 and the 9, the greatest common factor is 3. More so, I took out a negative 3. That means what you see in parentheses, each of those signs are going to switch. So I will have a 2x minus 3. Now, if you notice, just like last time, the two pieces in parentheses, as you see highlighted, are the exact same. That's a good thing. That should happen, and you want that to occur. Now, write that piece down one time. The two pieces that remain after I do the factoring, as you see highlighted here in purple, those don't necessarily need to be anything specific, but whatever they are, we write them down, and we have our other piece to factor. Now, our final answer in this situation is right there. We're done at that point for 100% credit. In this next example, we're going to notice, once again, we have four terms, and our directions are to factor, so we will approach it as factoring by grouping. Now, one bizarre thing is going to happen that we need to pay attention to, but we'll learn how to address that situation. So factoring by grouping says group your first two terms and group your second two terms. Now, if I group my first two terms as you see in red, I would have an 8r squared in common. What would remain would be an r minus 8. Now, looking at my blue terms, I have an r minus 8. I do not have necessarily a greatest common factor as we know it. However, we always need to consider that these values have a 1 in common. So I can take out a 1. Now, what would remain would just be an r minus 8. So we're at the same situation we were before, where we need to consider the term that repeats itself twice, the r minus 8. We need to go ahead and just jot that down one time. So we have r minus 8. After that, we need to consider the terms that are left over, as you see highlighted here in purple. We need to write those down just once. 8r squared plus 1. Now, we've successfully factored by grouping. Our final answer is, as you see circled.